Hi everyone, and welcome back to Module 3 of Chapter 11. So this is my second take on this one. I started recording and apparently my computer gets real sassy if I have more than one PowerPoint window open at the same time, so we're going to try this again. So this is the third module of the chapter, and it's the last one that's going to focus on motivation. Then our fourth module is going to talk about emotion, and so we'll go through some of the theories of emotion and things like that. So for now, Module 11.3 is on social and achievement motivation. So everyone obviously knows that in order for humans to survive, we have to satisfy needs for food, water, clothing, and shelter. But what about our other needs? Things like belongingness or a meaning and a purpose in our life. Common sense would obviously dictate that some needs are more important than others. And there was a researcher named Abraham Maslow who described a hierarchy of needs. So he basically said the needs that are associated with our basic physiological survival are more important than needs for kind of social belongingness and needs for achievement. So according to Maslow, once your survival needs are met, then and only then can you move on to higher level needs, the highest of which is known as self-actualization. So self-actualization, in Maslow's words, was basically the point at which an individual reaches their full potential as a human being, in terms of their creativity, their thoughts, and kind of their general acceptance of those around them. So here's a little pyramid, which basically Maslow used to describe his hierarchy of needs. I'm sure a lot of you have already heard of this before. It's used very often in terms of like motivational speaking and stuff to kind of illustrate how our needs and our motivations kind of work together. But basically, Abraham Maslow said that we had to meet our lower level needs, like our physiological, our safety needs, before we could move on to things like belongingness and esteem. And essentially, if you were not able to meet the lower levels, that was when humans would kind of behave badly and commit crimes and things like that. So although Maslow's depiction does seem logical in a lot of ways, it has also been widely criticized. The idea that we must fulfill one's needs before moving on to the next is simplistic, and the hierarchy itself seems biased towards an individualistic culture, so one that focuses much more on individual achievement rather than kind of the collective good. Self-actualization, which, as we mentioned, Maslow described as kind of the peak of his model, consists of a number of characteristics that put the individual's needs or goals first, which again wouldn't be very in line with a more collectivist culture. However, despite the hierarchy concept being flawed, this model highlighted the fact that human motivation does extend to a number of different areas. So we know now that you obviously don't have to fulfill every single lower need before you can move up. People can have high self-esteem and have a fulfilling career even if they don't necessarily have a life partner. You don't necessarily have to fill each of those needs before moving on to the next one. But overall, we do know that a lot of different needs and motivations exist, and so that's kind of the takeaway that we should be having when we're kind of examining Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the need to belong, which is also known as affiliation motivation, is the motivation to maintain relationships that involve pleasant feelings such as warmth, affection, appreciation, and mutual concerns for each other's well-being. The individual must have a sense that these feelings are part of a permanent relationship. So it's great if people have, a bunch of people around them who they like and they get along with, but it's a lot more influential if the person has, at least one other person that they really feel is kind of there for them unconditionally, and that can give them that strong sense of belonging. And it does actually appear fundamental in the same way that food and shelter are needs. So we can't really survive without other people in some capacity. An individual who has many positive experiences with a series of different individuals does not enjoy the same sense of satisfaction as an individual who interacts with only a few people, but regularly and for a long time. So it doesn't really seem to be about the quantity of relationships, but rather more about the quality, that they last for a long time and that, they become someone you can depend on and kind of look to for support when you need it. So in addition to mental health, social connectedness also has a dramatic influence on physical health. Loneliness is a risk factor for illnesses such as heart disease and cancer, and a sense of belonging can actually help predict chances of survival following heart attacks and bypass surgeries. So in some cases, the feeling of belonging that accompanies your friendship and family bonds becomes a form of love. And it's not necessarily, passionate romantic love, but you would be willing to make great sacrifices for these people. You know, you have a lot of trust in them and you look forward to spending time with them. Of course, as I mentioned, this isn't the only type of love we experience, but now we might move on to talk about what is romantic love. So what do we mean when we're talking about, you know, the love you have for a friend or a family member versus the love you have for a partner? So psychologists suggest that love is composed of two main components. We have passionate love, which is a physical and emotional longing for the other person. And then we have companionate love, which is the tenderness and affection we feel when our lives are intertwined with another person's. So passionate love appears to be most prevalent at the beginning of a relationship. You know, if you've ever kind of begun a new relationship with a new partner and the feeling of kind of like butterflies you get and just wanting to be around them constantly, that would be kind of indications of that passionate love being present. Well, companionate love appears to have a greater influence on the long-term stability of the relationship. So over time, typically, you know, if a relationship is to persist, that passionate love either kind of fades away or at least kind of comes into combination with that companionate love as well. So you kind of need both in order for relationships to kind of really persist long term. But what motivates us to seek out love? Love may be a goal-oriented state in a way that is similar to hunger and sex drives. So if you look at fMRI scans, functional magnetic resonance imaging, it actually appears that love may have kind of that biological basis and maybe kind of like a goal-oriented state that you're kind of pushed to seek out. Waiting for your one true love definitely seems a little daunting and probably improbable. So instead, we often use several factors to help us form deep and lasting attachments. And these are something that were kind of more emphasized in earlier textbooks that we use, but I thought they were kind of interesting to bring up here. So despite the fact that people often say, you know, opposites attract, it is actually the people that we are closest to and the most similar to that we tend to be the most likely to fall in love with. So proximity effect refers to the fact that we tend to form deep attachments with the people who are closest to us geographically. So literally the nearest our dearest. The similarity effect, on the other hand, basically says that likeness, either in terms of looks, attitudes, beliefs, values, or interests, is the second key predictor of whom we love, which is contrary to that old adage of, as I just mentioned, kind of opposites attract. So dating websites often try to match people up based on similarity or kind of must-have features, but they often fail. And based on what I just told you, that might seem kind of strange. But one of the reasons it may happen is that people are rarely able to predict what they must have. You know, a lot of people might go through life thinking that they want a partner who is a certain type, and then they end up with something completely different. And a lot of the tests that kind of dating websites employ when they're trying to kind of figure out if you're similar to someone else are based on unvalidated personality types and anecdotal testimonials. But overall, it is important to remember that they are right in terms of like attracting like. So in general, similarities do seem to be one of the major predictors of who we love. So now we're going to talk a bit about belonging and how it can influence self-esteem and our worldview. So belonging to a group, as we've kind of been mentioning, comes with a variety of benefits, ranging from physical security to the possibility of love. And groups are also what provide individuals with a sense of culture. So in some ways, our need to belong may actually be linked to our fear of dying. So there's something called terror management theory, which sounds really strange, but it basically states that human fear of mortality motivates our behavior. So the fact that we are conscious of ourselves as being mortals and you know, one day we will die, we're not kind of here forever, that can actually motivate us to act in certain ways, particularly those that preserve self-esteem and our sense of belonging. So we tend to use kind of buffers for this anxiety, such as the cultural worldview, which is a belief system about how our world should work, in order to prevent death-related anxiety from entering our conscious minds. Another buffer that we use quite often is self-esteem. So basically, we try to kind of use you know, our relationships and our ideas and beliefs about how the world should work in order to protect us from that fear of our own mortality. Psychologists study terror management theory by manipulating mortality salience. And basically what that means is they're essentially, we know that everyone knows that eventually they're going to die, but if we're increasing mortality salience, we're basically kind of reminding people of that fact. We're making the idea that, they're not gonna be around forever, and that, they are immortal, much more kind of present in that person's mind at the moment. And when we do that, we are able to see how they react. It's not really a nice thing to do, but that's kind of how we study these types of phenomena. So now let's move on to talk about achievement motivation for a little while. So achievement motivation is exactly what it sounds like. It's the drive to perform at high levels and to accomplish significant goals. So the drive or the motivation to achieve. However, there are a number of reasons why someone could be motivated to achieve. So it's not enough to say, all of us want to get somewhere with our lives and, be the best we can be and, achieve success in whatever way. We have to look at kind of what motivates particular people to perform in such ways and to kind of move towards their goals. And so for us to kind of begin that discussion, we have to talk about two types of goals that somebody could be kind of hoping to achieve. And the first are known as approach goals. So approach goals are enjoyable and pleasant incentives that a person is drawn towards. So approach means literally it's something that you kind of want to approach, something that you want to achieve, such as praise, financial reward, or a feeling of satisfaction. So in an approach goal, you're hoping to gain something. On the opposite side of that, we have avoidance goals. And avoidance goals are attempts to avoid unpleasant outcomes such as shame, embarrassment, losing money, or feeling emotional pain. So anytime we're motivated to behave in a certain way or complete a certain task to avoid a negative response, that would be considered an avoidance goal. And so your textbook, I believe, talks about, a teenager wanting to kind of make the basketball team for her school. And that same goal, it could be set in mind for different reasons. So she could want to make the basketball team because she really enjoys playing basketball and she likes spending time with her teammates and things like that. And so in that case, it would be considered an approach goal. So she's wanting to gain a spot on this team in order to achieve these desired rewards. On the opposite side of that, maybe this is a student who was on the basketball team last year and she really only wants to apply because she's scared, if they won't let her on this year, it will be really embarrassing because, it would mean that she's not a very good player. And so in that way, she's wanting to achieve that goal to kind of get on the team just to kind of prove she can do it and avoid embarrassment and shame. And so in that respect, it would be considered an avoidance goal. So basically, whether or not a goal is considered approach or avoidant is dependent on kind of why somebody is motivated to achieve it. Although both of these goals help explain elements of our behavior, there are also numerous other factors that influence our motivation to achieve, and so we'll talk some more about those as well. Now we'll talk about something called self-determination theory. So recent research has focused on examining what are referred to as universal needs. So there's actually been 3 universal needs identified. And this is kind of a little bit in contrast to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we know isn't really fully supported by the empirical evidence, but based on recent research, these would be kind of the 3 more universal needs that we've come up with. So the first is the need for relatedness, which is simply feeling connected with others and can be satisfied by forming meaningful bonds with others. So that social motivation that we were talking about earlier, that need to belong, that's really strongly kind of related to this universal need of relatedness. The next is the need for autonomy. So the need to basically feel in control of your own life. So you want to be in charge, you want to be doing what you want to do and kind of living your life the way you choose, and that would be related to your sense of autonomy. And then the third is competence. So individuals want to have the ability to perform a task at a skill level that is satisfying to the individual. It's important to note that the types of tasks that somebody wants to perform, somebody wants to achieve, will vary dramatically based on, individual context and culture and society and all those things, but basically having the ability to perform tasks that you want to perform at the skill level that, you're satisfied with, that would be fulfilling that universal need of competence. Something that's really interesting about this is that our motivation isn't necessarily influenced by how competent we are, but rather by how competent we think we are. So even if, you are maybe not so great at something, if you feel confident in your ability, that can still help you fulfill that kind of need, that universal need for competence. So the effect that your perception of your ability has on motivation is known as self-efficacy. And I believe I've probably talked to you a little bit about self-efficacy before. It may have been more in the last course, but basically self-efficacy refers to an individual's confidence that he or she can plan and execute a course of action in order to solve a problem. So self-efficacy refers to basically knowing you could do something, to feeling like you have the ability to achieve whatever desired outcome. So having a high level of self-efficacy improves performance and facilitates the choice of more challenging tasks. So it actually can influence what types of tasks and problems and things like that we choose to engage in. So people who have a higher level of self-efficacy are more likely to pick more challenging tasks that will be, maybe a little bit harder, but may have a bit of a greater payoff. So a theme running through all three of our universal human needs, so our relatedness, our competence, and our, goodness, I'm forgetting them already, autonomy, sorry, would be that basically we need to be able to feel in control of our life and our decisions, which is autonomy. So it's kind of ironic that I forgot about that one for a second. So these themes are part of what we call self-determination theory, which is a theory that states that an individual's ability to achieve their goals and attain psychological well-being is influenced by the degree to which he or she is in control of the behaviors necessary to achieve those goals. So if you feel like you have a high level of control and a high level of self-efficacy, you're going to be more likely to actually be able to achieve your goals and attain that sense of psychological well-being. So this is something, again, that I kind of threw in here from an old textbook, but I think it relates really well to what we were just talking about. I want to talk about expectations and self-efficacy. So how hard you work for something depends in part on your expectations. And this is kind of what we were just talking about with the self-determination theory. If you're fairly certain of your success, you're probably going to work harder in general to reach that goal. However, at times, expectations can create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So your expectations can actually make you behave in ways that make the expectation come true. And of course, this will be positive if you expect that you're actually going to be able to engage in a behavior effectively, but it can definitely also lead to some really negative outcomes at times. So for example, if somebody is trying to study for a test and they kind of have the thought to themselves, you know what, I'll never learn this stuff, this is useless, well then they're probably going to stop studying because if they think they're never going to learn it, then what's the point in studying? And so if they give up then they're actually kind of fulfilling that prophecy, because if they give up their studying because they feel like they're not able to learn it, they're not able to achieve that goal, then in turn they're actually going to do poorly on that test because they didn't study. So in that way they're actually kind of fulfilling their own prophecy of not being able to learn the stuff. And so it's really important to kind of be aware of these self-fulfilling prophecies because they can have really negative outcomes at times. So this is another reason that self-efficacy and kind of really believing you can do something can be really important in helping you achieve your goals. So now I want to talk a bit about two different types of motivation. So self-determination theory, as we were kind of just talking about, has been used to explain a number of behaviors, ranging from success in learning a second language to the motivation to exercise, and even the establishment of a healthy identity. However, in order to more thoroughly explain our behaviors, we need to look more closely at specific factors that might influence our motivation, such as whether our motivation is internally or externally generated. So intrinsic motivation, which can also be known as performance motivation, is motivation that's geared towards gaining rewards or public recognition or avoiding embarrassment. So whenever we're talking about anything extrinsic, we're talking about something that's external. So in this case, we are performing a certain behavior to get some kind of external reinforcement, whether it's an actual tangible reward, whether it's somebody telling us we did good, or even just avoiding a negative outcome. Those would all be examples of that kind of external extrinsic motivation. It's important to note that this type of motivation is not always effective, and if it is taken to the extreme, it can actually lead to becoming amotivational. So if you are reinforced too heavily in an extrinsic way for performing a certain behavior, it can actually lead to a loss of enjoyment in that behavior and lead to you kind of having that amotivational, those feelings of little to no motivation to perform the task. On the opposite side of that, we have intrinsic motivation, which is also known as mastery motivation. So this describes the process of being internally motivated to perform behaviors and overcome challenges. So essentially what we're talking about here is a genuine desire to master a task regardless of reward. So whereas when we're talking about extrinsic motivation, we're really heavily kind of relying on that kind of external reward in order to get us to kind of engage in a certain type of behavior. When we're talking about intrinsic motivation, it's motivation that comes from within. And so you can take something like, say, playing piano, for example. If you are somebody who sits down at the piano every evening and you play for a couple hours just because you love playing and it makes you happy, it brings you joy, that would be an example of intrinsic motivation. If then you got a gig where, they were going to pay you a couple $100 to show up at a restaurant and play, for a 5-hour shift during supper time, just kind of play around on the piano, and this is going to happen, most nights of the week, then that would be extrinsic reinforcement because you're being paid now. You're given an external reward in order to kind of compensate you for playing. And over time, if you reward something too much extrinsically, so if you're paid to play that piano every single night at that bar, it actually tends to lead to a decrease in your intrinsic motivation, because now you're no longer kind of seeing it as just something that you enjoy doing and something that brings you joy. It's actually starting to maybe even feel like work at that point. And that's really important because we've actually had studies that have shown that when students are praised for intelligence rather than for their effort, they tend to show less pleasure during learning and increased worry about how well they're doing. So, praising them for their intelligence and giving them that kind of external reinforcement can actually lead to decreased pleasure and increased stress. So in general, they tended to give up more easily and perform more poorly, and they even lied at times about their results. It is important to note that intrinsic and extrinsic motivation are not completely separate, so I kind of talked briefly about ways in which they can influence each other. And what we would say they're kind of best described at is kind of existing on a continuum that depicts how much self-determination an individual might feel for these behaviors. So how much the individual may feel they're actually in control of the situation. And if you look at this diagram of that continuum here, we do see that, something that is done for the sake of your own pleasure and something that you enjoy, that you have a lot of intrinsic motivation for, that would be really kind of close to the self-determined end of the spectrum, right? So if you're doing something truly because you enjoy it and you're doing it because it makes you feel good and you want to do it, then that would be intrinsic motivation. It would be considered very much self-determined in terms of you're doing it because you want to do it. When we move into the kind of middle ground of extrinsic motivation, well, then you're no longer doing it so much for your own enjoyment, you're doing it because you're being reinforced for it. And in that respect, that can kind of decrease the amount of control you feel like you have over that situation and that behavior. And then finally, and like we kind of mentioned earlier, if you really kind of frequently just reinforce something, too much extrinsically, it can actually lead to decreased pleasure, and at the extreme end can actually lead to a motivation which causes you to not want to perform that behavior at all anymore. So it's really important to kind of understand what types of motivation are influencing your behavior and how they might affect kind of your enjoyment of the activities that you're performing. So critically, where a behavior lies in this continuum, and I kind of just basically went through this in the example, can change over time. As I mentioned, if extrinsic rewards are given for intrinsically motivated behaviors, it can actually decrease the amount of intrinsic motivation one receives. This change in motivation is known as the over-justification effort. So it's kind of too much justification for performing that behavior leads to a decreased kind of pleasure. And it actually has profound implications for things like parenting, education, and business. So we won't really get into detail there, but hopefully you can kind of see what I'm talking about here, that it can really influence your kind of motivation and the pleasure that you feel in terms of performing certain behaviors and engaging in certain activities. So at other times, a behavior that was initially extrinsically reinforced can become internalized so that it becomes part of a person's identity. And this is associated with increased autonomy. So it isn't all bad. It isn't like, behaviors always go from kind of intrinsic to extrinsic and kind of have that sense of decreased pleasure. At times, if, say, you were a child and your parent started offering you, say, $5 for every A you get in school. And so you were working really hard because you wanted to get that extrinsic reward of, getting that money. Over time, you might actually see, just from the fact that, you've been studying so much more and you've been doing well in school, that it actually makes you feel good. And you no longer really need that reward to feel like you want to study. You're now doing it, for the sake of yourself and the fact that it makes you feel good. And in that way, not only can behaviors go from intrinsically motivated to extrinsically motivated, but it can also kind of happen the opposite of that as well. And of course, that would be associated with an increased sense of autonomy, because now you're studying for yourself. You're doing it on your own. You're not just doing it to gain that external reward. And that can be really rewarding. So finally, I want to talk briefly about some cultural differences in motivation. So Western cultures, as we know, tend to promote autonomy, so kind of individuality, being yourself and doing things, for the good of yourself and your achievement and development, whereas Eastern cultures put more emphasis on the greater good of the community. So therefore, while intrinsic motivation should lead to positive performance and emotions across culture, the same results are actually not found for extrinsic motivation. So we do see that people who are in more individualistic cultures will be less motivated to perform these behaviors than are those from collectivist cultures. So in an individualistic culture, we don't really necessarily want to perform things just for that intrinsic motivation that we're getting. Whereas in a collectivist culture where, the focus is the greater good, these cultures can view extrinsically motivated actions as being performed to help the family or community. And if that's the case, if they're doing it to kind of help the greater good of the community, then that can be really, really motivating for them. We also see cultural differences observed in the motivation to improve oneself. So research has indicated that Japanese participants were more motivated to work on a task after failing than were European Canadians. So it's really interesting how, the type of culture, whether we're focusing on the good of ourselves or the good of the group, how that can influence even our motivation to continue trying, to persist in the face of a challenge. Culture may play an even more complicated role for bicultural Canadians, so those who identify with both their family's ancestral culture as well as their current Canadian culture. It turns out actually that the extent to which intrinsic and extrinsic motivations influence these individuals depends on what culture they're identifying with at the time. So if you are giving them kind of cues that activate, images and thoughts of one culture versus the other culture, we can actually see different results in terms of this type of research. So when bicultural Asian Canadians identify with Western culture, extrinsic motivation was linked to negative emotion. So as we talked about earlier, being too extrinsically motivated can lead to a sense of not feeling in control of your behavior. And so if the Asian Canadians were identifying with the more Canadian culture, that extrinsic motivation could be linked to negative emotions. But when they were identifying with their Asian culture, their levels of negative emotion were unaffected. So it doesn't really feel so much as kind of an insult to their autonomy at that point, because when they're identifying more strongly with their Asian culture, they're probably more likely to be thinking of the greater good. And so they're not really as focused on whether or not their behavior is influencing their autonomy and their sense of individuality. And so here's a little diagram that kind of shows you the results of that study that we were just talking about. So you can see this is talking about level of negative affect. So overall, it seems like the Asian participant group had a bit higher negative affect in general, but they didn't really differ much in terms of the low or high extrinsic motivation categories. Whereas if you look at the Western participant group, when they had low extrinsic motivation, they were far less negative than when they were subjected to the high extrinsic motivation. And so we see that basically when the Asian Canadians were identifying with their Western culture, that extrinsic motivation was linked with very negative emotions, versus when they were identifying with their Asian culture, the extrinsic motivation didn't really seem to affect negative emotions in such a way. And overall, we didn't really see any cultural differences whatsoever in terms of intrinsic motivation. So it is just a really interesting example of how culture can affect even, your level of motivation and your response to certain types of motivation, even in individuals who actually kind of identify with more than one culture. So that is it for Module 3. I'm sorry, as I mentioned at the beginning of the first video, I'm really kind of feeling a bit under the weather today, so I know some of what I've been saying might be a little rambly, but hopefully you enjoyed it and kind of understood what I was talking about for the most part. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to email me. So that's the end of Module 3. We have one more module left, which will be our Module 4 on emotions, and then we will move on to Chapter 12 on personality. So I will talk to you in the video for Module 4.